Today, I want to open up a conversation about the ethics of historical research. This conversation is grounded in my experiences and my expertise. It will manifest in different ways in your work, but I'm really interested to allow enough time for this to be a two-way conversation. So I'm going to focus on historical research. There's also really important and interesting conversations to be had about the ethics of teaching, supervision, collaboration, and service. So if we have time, we might be able to discuss them in the question time. I am trying to enter into this conversation in a spirit of humility, and I can assure you that I don't have all the answers. These are my tentative grasping towards answers. But it does strike me that we don't often take time out to collectively discuss how we approach the ethics of our work, although I see evidence all the time that my colleagues are considering this. So my thinking about ethics has coalesced around two core human values, love and care. And it draws inspiration from a cluster of related literatures that approach research ethics from different angles. Traditionally, we all know that history was imagined to be a discipline of objectivity, rigour, and the scientific pursuit of truth. But most historians have moved on from that approach. Yet we still don't often talk about our work as being inspired by those quintessentially subjective and affective values such as love and care. So what would historical work look like if it centred upon care and love? How might we centre our own subjectivities and intersubjectivities in that research? So this presentation is a first draft of my love letter to Clio, the muse of history. So I'm going to start by positioning myself in all of this. I think all of my scholarship comes from my personal experiences, and I try to think about that as having the potential to enrich my work, especially when it's explicitly recognised and consciously interrogated. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me so you can understand where my ideas about ethics have come from. My ancestors hail from an ancient village called Hachit in the mountains of Lebanon, and also on the other side of the family from the rugged coastline of Cornwall in the UK. My mum was one of 8 children raised in a Lebanese Australian family in a small town in Western Victoria. My dad was one of 3 kids raised by a single mother in working class Richmond. In the mid-1970s, my parents decided to travel across the Nullarbor to forge their own independent life, and that's why I was born on Noongar land, where the Indian Ocean breaks upon the arid coastline of Western Australia. However, I've lived most of my life on the lands of the Kulin Nation, first on Wurundjeri country in Naarm or Melbourne, and now on Wathaurong country, where the briny Barwon River rushes into the fierce and freezing Southern Ocean. In choosing to make a home for myself and my family on Wathaurong country, I choose to reside by water on the shores of a lake surrounded by eucalypts and moona trees, in a spot where the air constantly hums with birdsong. And we've chosen very consciously this place and this community to raise our family. So I'm mother to 2 daughters, and I raise them with a supportive and equitable partner. These relationships with care and place have taught me much about myself and also what I value in my historical work. And as I've been thinking about these intersections of care in my personal and professional lives, I've also become increasingly aware that there's others talking about similar concepts in adjacent fields. In the past couple of years, I've been privileged to hear 2 really inspiring presentations about approaching history with love, and these were both specifically in the context of Indigenous history. Katrina Strigley is a non-Indigenous Canadian historian who's been approved by Anishinaabe elders to research and share some of their stories. In her keynote presentation to Oral History Australia's 2019 conference, she invited us to consider the ethics of Zagwin, or love, and she defines it as an ethical research framework that's deeply relational, that requires practitioners to position themselves as non-hierarchical and circular, requiring humility and an open heart. It's dynamic, based on relationships that change, and involves the present, the past, and the future. Lorena Barker is an Australian historian and First Nations woman. In a training workshop that I attended on doing Indigenous oral history, she invited participants to consider what it might mean to do research with Aboriginal communities with love. There were many aspects to the way that Lorena described this, but critically it means ensuring that the research benefits the community and not just the researcher. This is underpinned by several guiding principles, including do no harm to community, do no harm to country, and leave no footprints in the archive. And through talking with my colleague, Indigenous historian Julia Hurst here at Melbourne, I've come to appreciate how much this concept of do no harm underpins Indigenous research methodologies and is a key strategy of decolonisation. Now, what's really interesting is that in talking about research with love, there's parallels between these Indigenous methodologies and a feminist ethics of care philosophy. An ethics of care was first concretely developed by feminist philosophers, notably Carol Gilligan, as a moral theory that's based upon the recognition that humans are all dependent and vulnerable and to various extents intertwined in relationships with others. It was developed in contrast to the idea of an atomised, autonomous person acting independently of responsibilities towards others, the rational or self-sufficient actor that underpins much legal and economic theory. So it's a deeply relational ethics that recognises that we never act in isolation and argues that an ethical life involves thinking carefully about the impacts of our actions on others in the fullest possible sense. It was through my involvement with the Maternal Scholars Reading Group in Melbourne, and particularly the work of feminist social theorist Julie Stevens, that I was privileged to become more familiar with this ethics of care. And I also began to realise that it was already underpinning much of my work. It took me some time to understand that these several strands of my work, which I thought about as distinct, are in fact related. My work on ethical research methodologies, on sustainable academia, and on caregivers in higher education. So in thinking about these core principles, I've come to realise that they're guided by three moral imperatives: to care for people, care for place, and care for caregivers. Originally, I planned to structure this paper around the principles of do no harm to people, do no harm to place, and do no harm by omission. But as I thought about this more, it felt a little bit insufficient. I realised that do no harm is expressed as a negative concept, an action of withholding. To say instead that one will care for is a positive action, and it's an active expression of these principles. So as opposed to refraining from harm, caring for implies an active and deliberate nurturance. So the rest of this paper is going to be structured around these three principles. So what does it mean to care for people through our research? Some historians work with the stories of dead people, some with the stories of those still living. In assembling and analysing primary sources, we historians consult interviews, documents, objects, and more. When we talk about the possibility of doing harm through our historical research, we generally apply these concerns to oral history or interviews with living people. Ethics is discussed frequently and openly in the field of oral history. Generally, ethical obligations for the oral historian are thought to be satisfied by adherence to the formal and legalistic requirements of the University Ethics Committee. But I've argued that while these may satisfy our legal duties, employing an ethics of care lens suggests practising a more subtle ethics through our research with others. The moral impetus for subtle ethics arises from recognition that when we ask people about their lives in interviews, we're asking them for information which cuts to the core of their self-identity and what gives meaning to their lives. Humans construct narratives to give shape, purpose, coherence, and meaning to the otherwise messy chaos of existence. These narratives help us to feel okay about ourselves and our place in the world. So when we interview someone about their life story, we're playing with potentially sensitive material. There's no such thing as a 100% safe interview because we don't know what will arise when we open up a dialogue with another human being. So it follows that no interview can categorically be assumed to be low risk. And because of the special significance of an interview situation, Attention to subtle ethics means listening with the heart as well as the head. I advocate for paying attention to subtle, often non-verbal cues that influence the interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee, both before, during, and after the interview situation itself. And I also argue that we need to privilege the protection of the interviewee over a boundless quest for knowledge. I think this is a basic reciprocity when we ask interviewees to entrust us with their life story. In other words, I argue that it is the very least we can do. So this relates to how we interact with living historical sources through interviews. But do we also have ethical obligations to people whose stories we consult in archives? Such duties are potentially held by both the record keepers who manage archives and the researchers who consult them. A significant literature has emerged to critique the seeming objectivity of the archive and the power relations which structure the creation of such spaces. Who is allowed access, what is preserved, and how? In an influential paper, Caswell and Ciffer argue that archivists could apply an ethics of care to their work, mustering radical empathy in recognition that archival relationships are essentially affective in nature, and that archivists have ethical responsibilities based upon these affective relationships. And so they invite us to think about archivists as caregivers rather than sentinels, and to carefully consider ethical relations between four archival relationships: the relationship between archivist and record creator, between archivist and record subject, between archivist and user, and between archivist and larger communities. This is an expansive and empathetic approach not only to the duties of an archivist, but also to whom they are owed. In a brown bag seminar this year, we heard from the Public Records Office Victoria, who are beginning to incorporate such issues into their work as an archive. They discussed ethical issues in archives management, which have been largely opened up by the ready access afforded by digitisation. In other words, these issues become more acute in an age in which many records are available online. Some of the issues raised, for which there are no easy answers, include: can records which detail trauma inflicted many years ago still cause vicarious trauma now, especially for the ancestors of victims? As archives reflect the colonial violence of dispossessing Indigenous peoples, of their cultural practices and ways of knowing, how can archival practices be decolonised in a way that respects Indigenous rights while permitting some researcher access? And how can archives sensitively present records which are deeply imbued with the bigotry of their time of creation, including outdated values like racism and sexism? If archivists are thinking about the ethical implications of their role in managing access and preservation of records, so too are historians discussing the ethics of what happens once the historian leaves the archive and the danger of perpetuating vulnerabilities and inequities. Canadian historian Jane Nicholas calls this a debt to the dead. Such considerations potentially impact both individual researchers and the cultural institutions who manage and preserve sources. It's especially relevant if we seek to study subject matter that's steeped in exploitation, prejudice, and unequal power dynamics. So Nicholas, for example, studies the freak shows that toured North America. How do we engage with and represent the historical sources left behind without perpetuating that exploitation? Nicholas eventually concludes that we must still engage with these sources produced and archived in problematic ways. But she suggests that we produce history sensitive to the production and archiving of documents themselves and our place in defining, finding and regulating the topics of our inquiry. In other words, she's arguing for dissecting and illuminating the power relations that structure the archiving of documents and how they are accessed. Such histories are particularly troubling and sensitive when they record histories of trauma. Kirsten Wright has done recent work in an Australian context on trauma-informed archival practice through her work with Find and Connect. And Nell Musgrove and Shirley Swain have actively worked with care leavers, consulting them on how their historical records are represented and presenting with them at conferences. But we must recognise, as we did in the Brown Bag seminar, with Prov, that there's essentially a tension here between epistemology and ethics, between our desire to know and our desire to take care. This tension is not easily resolved. The second principle I want to discuss reaches beyond human harm. I've called it care for place, but I'm essentially referring to the more than human world. Environmental historians have critiqued the anthropocentric bias of the history discipline. Up until the last half century, studies of the past engaged primarily with the human past. Nature was merely the backdrop to our endeavours and exploits. The environmental historians have played a critical role in drawing our attention to the ways in which places, landscapes and animals also influence and interact with our human histories. Indigenous cultures around the world have long maintained that the more than human world has its own kind of sentience. Non-Indigenous knowledge systems are beginning to catch up with this awareness. For example, scientists have discovered the existence of a worldwide wood that trees communicate with and care for each other through complex subterranean systems, but they have their own ways of knowing. And legal systems have begun to recognise that legal standing or personhood can be held by inarticulate entities such as rivers, mountains and trees. As our knowledge of the more than human world grows, so does our capacity to care for it. I've argued that our obligation to take care of the more than human world through our research takes on heightened significance in these times of climate crisis. It's difficult to perceive and to fully inhabit the awareness that we're living through a climate emergency. It's often a slow violence, in the words of American eco-critic Rob Nixon. It's less spectacular than a world war and attracts less media attention. And we can most of the time get on with our daily lives. But increasingly, climate-fueled disasters are breaking through everyday life and reminding us that these issues are only worsening. So what ultimately are the ethical obligations of historians and other researchers in a climate-impacted world? Does it change the ethical obligations that we carry? Who ultimately takes responsibility for planet Earth? In a poignant and powerful book, Danielle Selemager invites readers to fully inhabit the embodied grief that the climate crisis evokes as a basis for thinking morally about what kind of response it demands from us. She asks, this is talking about the Black Summer fires, who killed the 3 billion animals we estimate died as a result of these fires? What about the trees, the grasses, the insects, the microbes, the fungi? What about the people? What about our faith in the future? What about summertime? Their deaths and the threats we face in the future are no tragedy. We know what killed them and we know what is threatening the lives of all of us who remain. But our knowing lacks language, lacks law, lacks a path to action. She suggests that we need a term for this new type of killing that has no boundaries in order to understand a sense of responsibility and culpability, just as the term genocide was coined to describe the unthinkable horror of the Holocaust. She proposes the phrase omnicide, the killing of all, not just humans, as if humans were the only beings that could be murdered, all beings. But how could we possibly begin to take ethical responsibility for a crisis as all-encompassing as omnicide? We cannot, of course, solve the problem individually. But I feel that everyone has a duty to respond to climate crisis because we are all living in what Greta Thunberg describes as a house on fire. I think there's both intellectual and emotional ways of thinking about how we care for place in a time of climate emergency. I've argued previously that academics have a heightened moral obligation because of our privileged capacity to respond. We have the skills to interpret research. We literally teach the next generation of citizens and leaders. We have the enormous resources of universities at our disposal, and our expertise is regularly sought by media. There is so much that we can do because of this privileged position that we occupy. And I believe that this capacity elicits a powerful responsibility when faced with an emergency of these dimensions. But beyond thinking rationally about climate change through the language of responsibility and rights, I agree with Selemager and Blanche Burley that we need to value our affective responses too. Both encourage deep immersion in the feelings generated by environmental crisis. For Burley, this is what living with climate change means. not becoming comfortable with the horror, but recognising that we are implicated in climate and we are changed by climate. We need to care in order to act, but paradoxically, it's easy to allow eco-anxiety to become inaction when we feel overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge. Both suggest that attention to our affective and embodied responses to climate is needed to muster a response that goes beyond apathy. They propose that we privilege our affective responses as much as our rational ones and avoid the dualistic thinking that divides them, and to develop the imaginative capacities to empathise with the environment, to care deeply about the more than human world. This is an affective and relational approach that holds much in common with an ethics of care that seeks to transcend anthropocentrism and extends that care beyond humans. So what would it mean to practice historical research in a way that demonstrates care for place? I can think of a few ways. We can consider how the more than human world features in our research. We can explore connections to local places and networks, and we can consider the environmental cost of our work, a care for place in the doing of our research. To take the first example, you might say that environmental historians are seeking to care for place by explicitly incorporating the natural world into their research and giving it equal weight to the human world. This shifting of the anthropocentric bias of the history discipline is a profoundly radical act. So what might histories look like that are not founded upon human constructs of place and time? In our working paper on sustainable history, we suggest that we have a role to play in creating a society that keenly understands that nothing happens outside of living Earth systems. And while acknowledging the need for everyone to have diverse research, we might each consider whether our research lends itself to normalising acknowledgement of humanity's constant embeddedness in the living Earth systems. At the simplest level, we all have the opportunity to consider the agency of non-human actors in our research, including weather, landscapes, animals and plants. A second way to care for place is through attention to our local places, to consider how we pay attention to the local places we inhabit and are personally invested in. Anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose speaks about the ways in which mobility and disconnection from place can impede deep ethical relations. She talks about the ways in which detaching people from place, particularly in New World settler societies, enables action to escape feedback from the place and to escape feedback from time. So are there lessons here for historical research? Can a closer connection to place enrich our affective and ethical understanding of it? The COVID pandemic has forced all of us into a shift away from the hyperglobalisation of the late 20th century and a turning back towards the local. As we are confined to our homes, our streets and our neighbourhoods, we're forced to stop and pay more attention to the things that surround us. And I think this can be turned to our advantage in many ways. For example, in the capstone subject last year and this year, Andy May has urged students to research the local places they inhabit for their research assignment, while Catherine Cavesi has encouraged them to study their own biographies and family histories. They've sought to develop a virtue out of a limitation. So perhaps one way we can do no harm to the more than human world is to pay closer attention to the places right around us. A third way we can care for place is to think about not just the subject matter, but also the way we do our research. My work in sustainable academia has proposed that we pursue opportunities to lower the carbon footprint of our work. Right now, our policies and procedures do the opposite. They implicitly encourage high carbon modes through systems of hiring, performance review, promotion and funding that reward hypermobility. I'm not arguing for 1 second that we stop all research activities that emit carbon, such as air travel, but simply that we measure and take into account the carbon impact of our work. This could be a line in our budget in the same way that we measure dollar cost. And we could justify how we've reduced the carbon cost as well as achieved value for money. I've been experimenting with these approaches in my recent funding applications, but they're not currently measured in any research funding schemes that I'm aware of. Melbourne Climate Futures is seeking to open a conversation in our own university about how we can begin to decarbonise our research practices. So if we concur the people and, so I'm not sure why this is coming up slowly. If we concur that care for people and care for place are principles that we value, how can we foster them? This is a much trickier topic because I'm not sure that we can or should force care upon anyone. But I have some ideas about what does not foster care and what works against care in academia. First and foremost, care takes time. It takes time to keep going back to interviewees and asking if they're okay with your interpretation of their story, even though they have legally given you permission to use it. It takes time to find the descendants of a person whose difficult story you found in the archives and consult with them on whether you can use it in your research. It takes time to measure the sustainability of our research alongside the dollar value. Time is a precious commodity in most domains of 21st century Australian life, but especially within the contemporary university. We know that in times like these, when precarious staff are cut and the workloads of remaining staff increase, there's associated stress, exhaustion and burnout. But an equally significant casualty of cost cutting is care. Just as time is under threat in our academic lives, tangible manifestations of care that spill over from personal lives are regularly denigrated. Care, especially the care of children by mothers, is consistently depicted as a limitation. I've encountered all sorts of interesting ideas about the impacts of combining caring for children with a career in academia and about what mothers really do when they're supposedly on maternity leave or working part-time. And when we apply for promotion and funding, we're encouraged to write justifications of how we can still perform despite the burdens of care that we carry. So these first two quotes here are examples of things that have been said to me about mothering in academia. The last one is from one of my rope statements about how care affects me. So my point is that I collude with these views because it doesn't feel like there's much space to acknowledge the idea that care might also be enjoyable and enriching. Moreover, the concept that we might choose to care is a radical notion indeed. These discourses that depict care as restriction or convenient excuse are not how I've experienced care in my life. They don't reflect my personal experiences. When I became a mother in 2013, I was quite simply shocked by how much it changed me. Nothing in all the parental advice literature I'd read prepared me for that. And I wondered if this sense of transformation had always been so, and this is where the idea for my doctorate was born. Motherhood did not only change my personal life, but also my intellectual work. I experienced the transformative power of care and slowly realised it had enriched my scholarship, the subjects I investigate them and the way I explore them. Another way of putting it is that constantly having to put another person's needs before one's own is an instructive lesson in the power of care. Parenting is a relationship that demands care for its success, but care is not exclusive to mothers or parents. We've all of us been cared for, and we're all involved in relations of caring with family, friends, colleagues, students and pets. I think the fact that my work has increasingly centred upon care at a time in my life when I'm deeply immersed in the daily care of small, irrational, demanding, ever-changing humans is no accident. And I can't help but wonder if we found different ways to talk about what caregivers bring to the academy and how care enriches our personal and professional lives, whether we might also find it easier to value an ethics of care across all of our academic research. So I'd like to conclude with a few thoughts on practicing history in difficult times. We live in times of crisis. I think it's become a truism. The climate emergency is no longer disputed and environmental disasters are regularly bursting through the fabric of everyday existence. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted pretty much everything we took for granted and shaken every certainty and solace. And it's very clear that many people are scared and disheartened and unsure what to believe in the face of a pandemic of misinformation. In times like these, I think the role of scholars and of public intellectuals is perhaps more important than ever before. In their book, The History Manifesto, Joe Gouldy and David Armitage issue a call to arms, arguing that the longer-term narratives that historians can provide are critical to solving the problems of today's world. This is a vision of the historian as superhero. Sociologist Ken Plummer explains that whereas he once strove for objectivity in his research, he now seeks values. He calls for a critical humanities that can provide values to guide us through an unstable and dangerous present, including the essential value of care for ourselves and the planet. I think it's sometimes possible to imagine that historians, by dealing with the past, have lesser obligations than scholars who contend with the present. But on the contrary, I suggest that it requires a special kind of compassion, sensitivity and imagination to comprehend our ethical relationship to the past, our duties to the dead. These are obligations that we take on not because we must, but because we know that we can, knowing that we are enriched and expanded by them. The neoliberal university does not necessarily reward ethical practices that go beyond the bare bones of legal adherence because it takes time. When our workloads increase and our time is pressured, we have less hours in the day to work with kindness and love, and we have less empathy to respond with patience and care. I think it's easy for deep and meaningful ethical practice to be left behind when time is short. So I do think it's critical that we explicitly advocate for the importance of these values if we want them to survive the belt tightening of these pandemic times. This is a radical ethics that's founded upon love rather than reason, upon care rather than competition, and upon relationships rather than individualism. I've come to realise that this radical relational ethics is at the centre of what I value most about my work and why I'm passionately in love with Clio. It's pretty clear that our old worlds, based upon philosophies of imperialism, colonialism and extractivism, are not sustainable. I think historians have a critical role to play in interrogating why these belief systems failed. And I also believe that in engaging deeply with these kinds of ethical questions, historians have the opportunity to actively contribute to public debates about the world that we want to create for the future. Thank you.